Okay, here we go. Today's lecture is on Native American cultures up to about 1600. We'll get to describe in general terms some of the characteristics of the interactions between Europeans and Native Americans upon contact starting in 1492. Here's an overview visually of what we're going to cover here. Just really a few slides on this particular one. This is the main lecture slide. Couple maps to let you, a couple charts, let you get a sense of some of the characteristics of Native American settlement, talk a bit about the Eastern groups, and my 2 points, assuming that you have seen by now the first 10 minutes of a video called The West by Ken Burns and Rick Burns. It's a marvelous overview of Native American cultures. In particular, in that film, it's about tribes in the West. But the basic point, I think, is the wide variety of cultural patterns among Native Americans. There's a tendency, I think, to talk about Native Americans as if there's some monolithic cultural group. And I think that is one of the central points to try to get more accuracy on. And then the second idea is the notion that Native American history or Native American cultural development was somehow static or trapped, or was in 1492 exactly as it was 1,000 years earlier. And there, of course, there's a lot of tribes where parts of their culture were similar, but there are ways in which understanding the dynamic quality of Native American history is really important. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and go back up to our first slide, which shows the Gateway Arch, built in the 1960s in St. Louis. St. Louis on the Mississippi River, where the Missouri River meets the Mississippi, was in kind of this story of manifest destiny of Euro-American white expansion across the continent, was considered the gateway to the West. And there's a really marvelous national parks exhibit underground underneath the arch there, that I encourage you to, if you're ever in that town, to visit, that has a much more sensitive kind of portrayal of the two-way interaction. But for the most part, this arch symbolizes people coming from the East and going to the West. And there's a wonderful book, came out about 8 years ago, called Facing East, that looks at colonial American history, the history of the United States, or what will become the United States before 1775, 76, and ask the question, what would it look like to tell that story facing East, facing from the perspective of the Native Americans seeing the immigration of so many Europeans onto their lands and their expansion across. And if your goal is to kind of tell the story of American history, it feels like that's a really important story to not marginalize, to not take out of the central part of the narrative, because indigenous people outnumbered Europeans in Eastern North America, even in the, the small section of the continent that we talk about in this class. Native Americans outnumbered Europeans by a lot, well up to 1750, 1760 in the East. So there's a story of what's going on in that part of the world ought to at least have some greater centrality to the majority of people that actually live there, and that was the Native Americans. So that's a nice metaphor to start us off. Native American cultural groups, another shot of the arch. Um, yeah, I have the civilization question there. I think the textbook talks about Cahokia. Oops, go back. Dangerous to get this going. Um, so this would be about where St. Louis is, and right across the river is the Cahokia Mound of what must have been tens of thousands of Native Americans living close enough together so that they could um, build those incredible mounds in the central part of what's now the United States. But generally, civilization and the kind of complexity that's involved with the transition from tribes and bands to a civilization, and all the complexity implied there, social class differentiation, political hierarchy, elaborate religious rituals and traditions, trade that goes across and among the various peoples that live in the civilization and outside that one. But it always has cities at the center of the definition of a civilization. And we can definitely say that the three large groups of Native Americans that had cities, the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incas in South America, were definitely civilizations. They lived in big cities, many of them, and had those other characteristics. But in the United States, at least at the end of the 15th century, you probably had what we would definitely call civilizations in the cities created by the southwestern Pueblo peoples out here. But it's hard to find many cities in the eastern half of the country. So we're going to be talking more about tribes and bands rather than what technically anthropologists might call a civilization. And among those tribes and bands, you have a huge diversity and variety of cultures, as Native Americans had for roughly, we're guessing, 15,000 years, developed all sorts of different cultural patterns to engage in different food procurement strategies. Inuit culture here in the Arctic, what the people we used to call Eskimos, have a very different culture than do Eastern Woodlands, than do Pueblo peoples, or even Californian groups and Northwest Coast groups. And that variety is kind of the central point here, is that Native Americans didn't look upon themselves as Native Americans. They called themselves the people, the tribal identity, and everyone else, as was said in this video, were others, people that don't belong. And Europeans were often thought of as, well, they were often called heaven sent allies to help us defeat our enemies, close quote. As Native Americans tried to make sense of these new people, they, of course, filtered their identities through their ongoing and changing political rivalries and alliances with the people that they lived near. So we'll talk about this interaction between Old World, Eastern Hemisphere, Europe, Africa, to a much lesser extent Asia in this encounter, and Western Hemisphere, New World, Native American peoples. Oh, heck, this map wants to come up, so we'll just let it stay here for a second. That's a different, clearer view of the basic cultural groupings. But, and there's Cahokia. Yeah, you can see it. But the interaction here that is often termed the Columbian Exchange, and the Columbian Exchange just refers to the ecological and biological exchange of life forms in the 150 years after the Columbian encounter. And of course, that's 1492, the voyage of Columbus, and the way in which the planet was transformed by 1600 in the Columbian exchange of those life forms. Most of you know this term from other classes, I'm sure, but we know a lot about the stuff that comes from the Western Hemisphere and goes to the East, whether it's potatoes or tomatoes, both of which were unknown in Europe prior to the Columbian exchange. What we now call corn, squash, pumpkins, wild turkeys. Those are some of the major biological goods that made their way from the New World to the Old World, as they say. And coming from east to west were things like horses, reintroduced, cattle, citrus, and all sorts of domesticated animals, pigs and goats. And as all of you know, disease in the form of different flu strains. Smallpox was probably the most deadly of the various diseases that made their way to the Western Hemisphere. And all that is part of the Columbian exchange with, as you know, kind of demographically disastrous results for Native American populations. No one knows how many Native Americans were alive before the Columbian exchange. It's clear that I guess I'm just going to be backlighted. It's clear by these charts that something pretty amazing happened. But out of a population, I think most people are landing close to a number like 40 million in the Northern and Southern American hemispheres. I've seen estimates as high as 100 million, and that might perhaps be accurate. And estimates can go lower down to maybe 30 million or so. Almost all anthropologists are convinced that about 90% of the population of Native Americans lived south of what is now the boundary between the United States and Mexico. So about 10% of all Native Americans lived up here, and about 90% to the south. Regardless, the demographic catastrophe of something like the first island seen by Columbus, with about 4 million Native Americans on Hispaniola. Within 100 years or so, 125 were left alive for a death rate of 99.997% within 80 years. Mexico, from Cortez in 1519 to about 90 years later, went from 25 million to a million for a death rate of about 95.7%. And Peru, they got off easy. I know that's terrible to say, even as a joke, but 82%, somewhere probably between this 82 and this 95% was probably the most common. This is what happens to all Native Americans who are exposed to European microbes and diseases within 3 generations or so of encounter between East and West. And that, of course, is one of the most terrible threads of American history, one of the most tragic consequences of all this, if not the most. The demographic results of the Columbian exchange are stark and unavoidable. But one of the things I want you to be aware of is that usually what you had were explorers coming through and landing on the coast and exposing the coastal Indians to these diseases early on. And 20, 30, 80 years later, settlers would arrive to try to colonize and actually live in the regions that had already been exposed to European diseases by those first encounters by the explorers. So that when Jamestown is founded, or when Cortez gets to Mexico, or when the Pilgrims get to Plymouth Rock, Native Americans are already dying. The young population, especially of Native American groups, is dying off. And these are cultures, many of which are in crisis, are in serious change. And that's something to kind of be aware of, is that help to determine the result of who was going to survive these early encounters. So why Native Americans were so susceptible to European and African diseases in the Columbian Exchange is because the Western Hemisphere had almost no domesticated animals, llamas in South America. But in terms of the reason why Europeans had such resistance to these diseases is they had been living among their domesticated animals for 10,000 years, 8,000 years, and had developed resistances to new kinds of diseases that those animals exposed them to. And literally, many of them, slept in the same room with their cattle and hogs. And so there was very close proximity. And so you'd had 10,000 years of buildup of resistance to flu bugs and smallpox. And Native Americans didn't have any of that in their DNA. So that when they were exposed to Europeans, they just didn't have any of those kinds of abilities to resist. So yes, the demographic catastrophe is kind of the big thing here. I just threw these two maps in here because they're great. They're in your book. Gives you a good sense of tribal identities throughout North America. And of course, this shows population density. And for us in California, this for a lot of us is a little bit surprising to see that at least the part of California that was inhabited, let's just exclude a lot of the southern deserts, the population density here was pretty intense, and in the Northwest coast. And most of our story will be the encounter with the southeast and northeastern groups, with a more spread out population. This gives you some sense of the total numbers of Native Americans in different parts of the country, or the continent, I should say, north of Mexico. Okay, so that's handy. And in the eastern groups that encountered Europeans in the 16th and 17th centuries, the odds are that they'll belong to one of these three large groups of Native Americans: Algonquin, Muskogean, and Iroquois. And from considering them from the least settled, most nomadic to least nomadic, that would go Muskogean, Algonquin, Iroquois. The Muskogeans are here in the southeast. The Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Creeks. These southeastern groups of Native Americans did not farm for very much of their caloric intake, although they all farmed, but they're the most nomadic. They relied on hunting, especially deer, in this part of the world for a good deal of their calories, and their societies were geared around that kind of hunting project. So that's the Muskogean group here. The Algonquin group is this group here in this color, and this happens to be where Jamestown is founded, right here right here on the James River in Virginia. And there's the Powhatan group you can see, and the Pilgrims will arrive here in and the Puritans here in Massachusetts. Both of these, the Algonquins dominated the coastline here. They also dominated out here, the Shawnee, and up into the Great Lakes region. And this map doesn't show it, but they also are the predominant group in Canada and the St. Lawrence River Valley. So the Algonquins kind of have this large kind of U-shaped, with a little break here, geographic dominance. They farmed more than the Muskogeans did, but they usually farmed 3 or 4 different fields every year, moving from village to village in order to go to different hunting grounds, produce crops at slightly different cycle. And yeah, they were semi-nomadic, a lot more settled than the Muskogeans. The Iroquois group is up here, upstate New York. The most famous tribes up here: the Mohawks, the Senecas, the Cayugas, the Oneidas. Here you go, the Susquehanna, the Erie, and then the Cherokee down here in the mountains of the southeast. That's the Iroquois group. They are distinguished by a few interesting characteristics. They're the most agricultural. They are relatively settled, mostly lived in villages year-round. They made famous the planting of the 3 sisters, yes, corn, beans, and squash, which when grown together tended to keep the soil nutrients intact and very productive. They lived in villages, and they came together as a league, as a group that has a central Iroquois league that consists of more local tribal leadership. So in that sense, they have a federated system of government. Franklin mentioned it as a federal system of government, where you have local political rule and kind of supra-local political rule in the form of the Iroquois League. So that they had that model in place throughout the colonial period. They're matrilineal and matrifocal, along with the Hopi tribes of the Southwest, the Pueblo Southwest. Let's see if I can show you them. Yes, so there they were. These folks, the Iroquois, family identity was passed on through the mother's line, matrilineal, and matrifocal in the sense that women have a lot of political power in the Iroquois tribes. They generally chose the chiefs and had a lot to say about tribal policy. So that's an interesting legacy that we were exposed to by the Iroquois groups there. All right. So that's kind of it. I mean, most of what I have to say about Native American cultures are these 2 main themes that we mentioned earlier. And most of what I want you to do with this is to be inspired to take a real history class on Native American history, or or an English class on literature, or an anthropology class on Native Americans. I know there's tremendous interest out there in their history. But I guess what I want to try to emphasize for our purposes is try to get you to think about what's important and how does it help to shape our understanding of the early years of contact among Native Americans and Europeans, and kind of be aware of that as we enter into chapters 3, 4, and 5 that we'll talk more about those encounters between the colonial settlers of the European colonies and especially the English colonies and Native Americans. That's it. Thank you very much.